No, where's the music? I was getting used to that nice music coming up. So really good to be here. Thanks to Alan and Phage for having us come. And it's really good to follow Nikki and Alice, who've been so incredibly generous with their expertise and their resources and really trying to help us in Asia get off the ground, because I think we're a few years behind what's been happening here in Africa. So just in terms of how we approach capacity development, I just wanted to provide a bit of context in Asia. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's more people that live outside that are inside that red circle than those who live outside in the world. So we're in this incredibly dense, high-risk environment, and in Asia, there is no CDC. And government-to-government work sometimes moves slightly slowly. So this is one of the reasons why we as an academic institution are hosting the Secretariat for Asia PGI to try and really leverage collective learning in a way that's, perhaps less threatening than some of the G2G work that's taking place. Asia PGI is really a network of support for 14 countries. We call it a coordination and capacity development platform, and it brings together national public health institutions, academic bodies, as well as NGOs in the private sector in some contexts, depending on how pathogen genomics is organized. So this is a list of sort of the 50 or so partners that we're working with across the region. And, for me, as an infectious disease clinician, it's actually good to be back in South Africa, which has been my home for 10 years or so before I was in Asia. As you see patients, you just realize how infrequently we actually understand what the heck is going on with someone. The number of times you give out a broad-spectrum antibiotic, an antimalarial, get out your rosary and your prayer beads and hope somebody gets better. That's the norm. And I think we're at a real turning point now in terms of our ability to really understand the burden of disease with genomics, and a really exciting time for translating the genomic building blocks into new diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines much more quickly. So it's really around, for me, trying to take something that 5 years ago was a research tool, certainly in Asia anyways, and really develop a public health approach to pathogen genomics. And what I mean by that is focusing on high priority pathogens, doing things in the most cost-efficient way, particularly in ways that combine genomics with molecular diagnostics effectively. They need to be linked. To the extent possible, doing things in real time, and making sure that what we're doing is not just nice to know, but actually actionable. And of course, while we've been very good during SARS-CoV-2 and doing this for human surveillance, trying to develop a broader One Health approach to human-animal interface, which is incredibly important in Asia, as well, of course, as environmental surveillance. So what we've been doing for the past couple of years, because we've only been set up since sort of late 2021, is really listening and doing a detailed assessment, we call it a landscape assessment with countries, looking at end-to-end capacity in genomics and how things have really transformed in the context of SARS-CoV-2, so that we're providing capacity development in a way that meets the needs and demands of countries. So we've put together this recently published roadmap for pathogen genomics in Asia that looks at aspects from who the partners are, how things are financed, what sort of policies and guidelines exist, all the way through to bioinformatics, data sharing, and so forth. And I'm going to highlight some of the key findings from that because it influences how we're approaching capacity development. Let's just jump in here. And just to say that for us, it's not just the genomics and bioinformatics training, it's making sure that the people that are trained are embedded into a system that's going to support them when they go back, and making sure that that includes aspects of having effective strategy design and systems, forecasting, costing budgets, investment cases for genomics, addressing particularly tricky procurement, supply chain bottlenecks, and so forth. So all of that is actually really important in terms of how we conceptualize capacity development. The box on the left is the broad range of partners that exist across Asia. But what I can say is that in some countries, it's primarily run by government, some countries primarily by academic institutions. And building bridges between these groups where they exist is an incredibly important part of our job. In most countries, while there's technical expert panels for genomics and some guidelines exist, very few countries have comprehensive strategic plans. And having a plan is really, a fundamental place to start, particularly as we transition from, dealing with epidemic pathogens towards endemic pathogens and things that are going to be funded through government resources in the long term. That really requires that strategic plan. So we've been spending a lot of time, and it was really good to hear the work by the Africa CDC guys, Francis and Joseph and others, talking about how they're approaching prioritization for genomics. But we've been spending a lot of time thinking about what pathogens to prioritize, how do you embed genomics within existing laboratory and surveillance systems, and what's the value? What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with environmental surveillance data, for example? And this really is work that targets policymakers, budget holders, and then we look towards trying to develop effective strategies for planning and support. So there's a range of different tools that we've sort of developed to do this that look at how the different kind of contexts of laboratory and surveillance systems in terms of what the capacity is, and the various utilities that exist for genomics as they apply to different pathogen groupings and platforms. And as you move from sort of left to right, you move from having public health utility to, as things become more real-time, you can do more effective contact tracing, clinical management, and then, of course, the development of new diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. So having that kind of systematic approach and be able to articulate very clearly the value out of genomics is very important for policymakers who have a range of competing interests, from basic immunization to maternal-child health care and so forth. So you've got to make the argument about why genomics is going to change the game. So we've been spending a lot of time doing that. And this is a quick example, but I mean, if a country chooses to prioritize, say, TB, dengue, respiratory pathogens, and environmental surveillance, those are embedded within existing surveillance systems. There's different utility for genomics. And then once you have that, it's a single lab or laboratory network that's going to be supporting all of those different use cases, right? So once you have that, defining sampling strategies will enable you to do forecasting, volume, support questions of systems design, and think about these ideas of investment cases. So from a capacity development standpoint, this is an important starting point. And again, of course, it's about combining in a cost-efficient way how we're using more conventional diagnostics with genomics. Another thing that we don't talk too much about, but is the thing that countries want to talk about when you discuss genomics, is issues around cost and supply chain. Poor countries pay about 10 times more per sequence than wealthy countries do across the world. We can talk a lot about why that is the case, but in addition to that, across Asia, the average resupply time is almost 2 months between making an order and receiving equipment and consumables. And there's about a month between collecting a specimen and reporting a result. And if we're talking about real-time systems, we've got to start to address some of these issues. So we have a whole capacity development team that's looking at what we call a strategy think tank that looks at market intelligence for pathogen genomics, for new products as well as for innovations, what's coming on the market, what's going to change the game, what's going to make things simpler, easier, and more easily to democratize, as well as developing capacity with countries around supply chain support. And I won't get into this in too much detail, but there's a range of, for example, maybe just one quick example, things sit at customs for, 6 weeks in some countries, and, for consumables, right? So they arrive to the lab with 2 weeks left or 3 weeks left of shelf life, which results in inefficient system utilization, which drives up costs. These are solvable problems, right? But it's an important part of how we think about capacity development in the Asian context. And they're issues that, if you can approach it as a group rather than lab by lab, you're likely to address some of these issues much more effectively. In terms of the situation in Asia, all countries have the capacity to do sequencing in country, post-SARS-CoV-2. This just gives you a sense of the range of platforms, perhaps a bit more of a balance with Illumina and ONT. Although MGI, BGI, the Chinese company, has a relatively small market share, they're coming in about 30% lower in terms of their price point, and likely that market share is going to expand. There's also a lot of new innovations in China that I don't have time to go into, but they're potentially really game-changing, and having a more diverse and competitive market with transparent pricing for genomics is going to be incredibly important to support adoption and scale. I won't spend too much time on this, but what we're trying to do here is basically be a Tinder service between people like Nikki and Vietnam. So really learning from the master trainers, the NGS Academy, from Chan Zuckerberg, from Welcome Connect, and bringing the global expertise together with countries in Asia. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And for me, there's a huge amount of scope to start to align curriculum and start to develop something that we can all build upon in ways where there are some basic standards in place. We do have a multi-pathogen, a multi-platform training academy set up in Singapore that allows countries to come together. It is important, some of the comments that were made earlier, what do you get out of these trainings? I mean, a once-off is important, but in Asia, as I mentioned, governments and academic institutions often don't work well together. And between countries, folks are just starting to trust each other. So building trust relationships by doing in-person training is actually an incredibly important starting point. But I really love the idea of global classrooms and how we can think about ongoing advanced virtual training that really builds upon the cohorts that have been there. We've done some of our initial training at our academy just very recently, focusing on influenza and novel pathogens. But just to acknowledge that this was done in the context of a partnership with the Arctic Network, and really look forward to taking discussions further with folks that are in the room here who are keen to kind of support some of the emerging work that's taking place in Asia. Our plan is to really do training around the different pathogen grouping. That seems to be what countries are looking for. And we're also keen to combine not just labs and bioinformatics, but actually integrate that with planning and strategy design, because too often, our sampling is based on our budget rather than having a rigorous statistical approach to how we're thinking about how many gene expert positive TB cases should we be sequencing, for example, and including that into our national plan. I think I'll skip this one. And just to say, I guess, as our sort of final slide, one of the things that we are trying to do as well around capacity development is shift genomics out of the surveillance space and into this space around new tool development. We really think that the future for genomics and the value proposition is going to be much stronger if we can start to demonstrate use cases where we're developing new diagnostics, new vaccines, and so forth, and creating scientific exchanges between laboratories as part of how we think about capacity development. So just to summarize and to conclude, meetings like this are really important, and we don't have them enough in Asia. But creating a community of practice around bioinformatics, around genomics, around wet lab practice, around how we're thinking about different use cases is critically important. So I'm just encouraging Simon and Alan that we'd love to host the next PHAGE meeting in Singapore in a couple of years from now. So thanks very much.